Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're talking about whether the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom will be releasing alongside new hardware from Nintendo. That's right, I am referring to a Nintendo Switch 2, the next generation of Nintendo Switch. Could this be happening? I think there are some peculiar things going on, and that's what we're talking about today. Now before we jump into things, let me first very briefly mention my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out. It's linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe or perhaps consider joining as a member. So there's actually a few different details that I'll be going through throughout the course of this video that have grabbed at me over the course of this year that really feel like they might be suggesting a simultaneous release for both Tears of the Kingdom and a Nintendo Switch 2 or some sort of new hardware next year, May of 2023. And the first thing I'll be discussing here is the actual launch timing update for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel. That is the title of the video. I know it's called Tears of the Kingdom now. So in the video, it's a short minute-and-a-half video that was uploaded back in the springtime of this year, the Zelda series producer Eiji Aonuma came out and said, "However, we have decided to extend our development time a bit." But he does not say why they are extending their development time. He simply has said they have decided to do so. And what's interesting about that to me is when we take a look at previous Zelda delays, they're always sort of discussed as something that is to improve the gameplay or quality of the game. But this time it's just more of a blanket, we have decided to extend our development time. It could be for the quality of the game. It could be for other reasons, maybe scheduling reasons, or it could also be because they want to release this Zelda with a new piece of Switch hardware. And this situation honestly reminds me of previous Zelda delays. One that comes to mind is the original Breath of the Wild. This game was slated for holiday 2016, and when did it release? March 2017. They delayed the game so it can come out March 2017 with the new Nintendo Switch. And that was a great idea, because Breath of the Wild went on to be the best-selling Zelda game of all time. It really helped to propel the Switch to have such a strong launch, and right now the Switch is in contention to be one of the greatest selling systems of all time. It's already up there, but it has the potential to become the third, second, or even first best-selling system of all time, not just for Nintendo, but across the board for the history of the industry. And this isn't the only time that Zelda really helped a Nintendo system to have an incredible strong launch and helping to propel it to have historic sales. We actually saw Twilight Princess back in 2006 a launch alongside the Nintendo Wii, which is also one of Nintendo's best-selling systems of all time. And what's really interesting about this is that Twilight Princess was also slated for holiday 2005, and it was delayed and came out holiday 2006 instead to launch alongside the Nintendo Wii. So we saw dual releases for both Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild. Both games had enhanced versions for their next generation counterparts, but they still came out on the previous systems. The point is, there is a history here of major Zelda games having a publicly known targeted release timing. The games get delayed and they come out a little bit later, not a lot later, but a little bit later to come out alongside new hardware. So when you factor in this weird wording where Aonuma doesn't even tell us it's about quality like he has in the past, and then we look at the history of Zelda releases where it seems like they're bound to come out in that particular year, and then they're delayed into the next year to come out alongside new hardware. So there's already that history here, so I kind of have this in mind already, but with everything else I want to talk about, I feel like this goes deeper than that, so let's continue on here. When we take a look at the history of Zelda releases, yes, Breath of the Wild was used to push the Switch, yes, Twilight Princess was used to push the Nintendo Wii, but this wouldn't be the first or second time Nintendo has used Zelda to push new hardware. We saw them use Majora's Mask 3D to push the new Nintendo 3DS, we saw them use The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening to push the Nintendo Switch Lite. This is something Nintendo does. But now let's move on to this weird timing for Tears of the Kingdom. Tears of the Kingdom is coming out May 12th of 2023 here in the West. Now, that's a perfectly fine release date, but there are a few things about it that are a little weird to me. One, historically speaking, the major 3D Zeldas come out in the holidays. The one major exception being Breath of the Wild. because it was delayed outside of the holidays because the Nintendo Switch was not ready. The Wii U was already a dead system by that point, so there was not really much reason to support it back then. So it came out alongside the Nintendo Switch in March. And that brings me to the other timing. So okay, March would have made sense. We've seen throughout the Switch era, Nintendo's had major games come out to close the fiscal year. Obviously the Switch and Breath of the Wild, March of 2017, but we've had other major games come out to close the fiscal year throughout the Switch generation as well. Animal Crossing New Horizons, Monster Hunter Rise, Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Nintendo usually likes to have something come out in March to close out the fiscal year. And the reason they do this, because the fiscal year ends in March at the end of that month, so they want to report good numbers to their investors, their shareholders, so having that nice little final bump is a great way to do that. Yet, interestingly, we don't even have anything slotted for March right now. We have Fire Emblem Engage coming out in January, we have the Kirby remake coming out in February, nothing major from Nintendo in March, but we do have Tears of the Kingdom coming out in May, which is strange. So not only are we not getting Zelda in the holidays, which is usually when they like to have Zelda come out, but it's also not coming out in March, the other time we've seen big Nintendo games come out to close out the fiscal year so they can make things look good for their investors. Just May, which just seems a little random. Of course, it's totally possible that just based off scheduling and other games they may have not announced yet, that they simply decide that this is a good time for the game to come out. Totally possible here. But let's dig a little deeper here. This is the Zelda side of things. But what about this Switch 2 side of things? What sort of evidence or patterns do we have suggest that maybe new hardware could come out alongside Zelda this time around? Well, firstly, we know new hardware is coming. It's really just a question of when. We even know that there is literally a new NVIDIA chipset that's being worked on for a next Nintendo system. NVIDIA had a breach. There was a leak, and a lot of information came out, including a far more powerful version of a Nintendo Switch. So much of a power leap that this would have to be a next generation system. So there's literally evidence out there. This isn't a debate, this isn't a speculation, this isn't a theory, this is a legitimate leak. Now, the question is, will they use this hardware? Will it be changed? When will it come? That we do not know. Are there features to the system we don't know about? There are a lot of mysteries and questions marks, a lot of things that are unconfirmed, but the fact remains, NVIDIA is working on more powerful hardware. There is something that exists out there already, and it will eventually come. And because it's already out there already, the suggestion is, well, it's not that far off. Now, what does not that far off mean? That's a very relative term, and in truth, it could mean next year, but it could also mean the year beyond. We don't know that. But something we do know are the pattern of releases we've seen for the Nintendo Switch. So Nintendo Switch came out March of 2017. Then about 2.5 years later, we saw the release for both the Switch Lite and a revised version of the base Switch that has better power consumption, better battery life. And then in October of 2021, we saw the release for the Nintendo Switch OLED. So we're seeing gaps of 2 to 2.5 years per Nintendo system. So once we enter 2023, May might be a little bit earlier than say September or October, but it's within the realm of possibility that we could see new hardware come out around this time. It wouldn't be too far off from the typical Nintendo pattern we've seen during the Switch era. And obviously I'm making a little bit of a concession here when it comes to the patterns, because I am making this argument that maybe Switch hardware could come out in May. So do also take that into consideration here. We may have to wait a little bit later. Not everything I'm saying in this video is to intend that for sure a Switch 2 is coming out this May. I'm simply pointing out things that seem to sort of line up that make it seem like a likelihood. So let's continue pointing out things that seem to point in this direction. So during a Q&A with Nintendo's president Shuntaro Furukawa earlier this year, he was questioned on whether Nintendo had any plans to release a new Switch hardware for the fiscal year. What's interesting about this is that he had no comment to make. Because previously, when there were no plans to release new hardware, he simply said no. Nintendo has no problem with saying no when there are no plans for new hardware. So what that suggests is that there are at least talks and considerations, and there could be new hardware coming. maybe it doesn't come out quite in the fiscal year. Look at where we're at right now. It's probably not the case that a Switch 2 is coming out by the end of the fiscal year, which would be this March. But May time would be close. And if that's the case, then it probably would have meant that yes, there were conversations, there were considerations, they were trying to get this new piece of hardware out by the end of the fiscal year. And even more recently, we've gotten more Q&A where Nintendo has opened up about different things, including Shigeru Miyamoto, about backwards compatibility and integration of Nintendo Online accounts with future hardware. So the fact that Nintendo's opening up about this and discussing some of their ideas for new hardware and how they're going to push forward, this sort of suggests that they've already had those internal discussions, there are plans coming together, they're prepping. We aren't that far off. Again, this does not mean that it's happening next year to come out alongside The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom this May, but it does mean that we are within striking distance. Could be about a couple years, could be about a year, could be less, but the point is, we are getting close. But how close exactly? Because something else that we should take into consideration here is that there is the huge semiconductor shortage. This is something that Nintendo has repeatedly cited as something that has held back their sales. Even with Nintendo's most recent financial reports, they talk about how there has been a semiconductor shortage that has impacted things. Check this out. For Nintendo Switch hardware, we reduced our forecast by 2 million units to 19 million units. Although hardware production is on a recovery trend due to gradual improvement in procurement of semiconductors and other components, we revised the sales forecast based on the production and shipments to date. So this little factoid here, this quote I'm bringing up, is kind of benefiting both sides of the argument. From one angle, they are noting that yes, the semiconductor shortage has impacted sales. It's at least a part of that equation. But on the flip side, they're also saying that the semiconductor shortage situation has been improving. And here's more information from earlier this year as well from Nintendo's financials. We learned that for the fiscal year of March 2022, Nintendo invested over 66,000 in millions of yen for raw materials and supplies, which is more than double than they ever have invested in for the entire Switch generation. For perspective, for fiscal year March 2019, they invested 32,000 in millions of yen in raw materials and supplies, and during this time we saw the release for the Switch Lite and the revised battery version of the base Switch. And now in fairness, we're not seeing any dips suggesting something for Switch OLED specifically, so we're not entirely sure what this may mean. It doesn't necessarily mean that putting all of this investment into building up hardware that is the next generation Switch could be, but could also just be preparing for potential delays, gearing up for what could happen. There's so many little possibilities here, but with such a large, substantial investment that's greater than any other during the Switch era, it definitely has you thinking, wonder what that's for. Towards the end of the Switch era, they are making a huge investment in raw materials and supplies. For what? When you factor in, we know about the Nvidia leaks showing that they are working on new Switch hardware. When we take into consideration the pattern of hardware releases for the Switch where they seem to come every couple years, when we also take into consideration that Nintendo has noted that while the semiconductor shortage has impacted sales, they are seeing gradual improvements in that department. And when we also take a look at this history of Zelda, the major 3D Zeldas being used to push new hardware, and we see the history of Breath of the Wild being delayed when we thought it was about ready to come out, so it can come out alongside the Nintendo Switch, and the same also for Twilight Princess back in the day, and both those games leading to incredible success for their respective systems. It seems like something Nintendo would also want to do with Tears of the Kingdom. When we also take into consideration that the gaps between major Zeldas are getting larger and larger, we're now looking at the largest gap ever between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which is supposed to be a direct sequel, by the way. Direct sequels typically take a shorter amount of time, not a longer amount of time. Point is, Zelda's come out maybe twice every decade. So Nintendo probably wants to take full advantage of this new Zelda because it's probably going to be a very long time before there's another one. And if we're fairly close to the release of new hardware, they're probably going to position Tears of the Kingdom to push that particular system. Now, to offer up a counter argument that I have brought up in previous videos, if they don't do Tears of the Kingdom, they're probably going to do something. What would that something be? Well, typically, if it hasn't been Zelda being used to push new hardware, they use Mario. Mario Odyssey came out in 2017, and we haven't had a new mainline 3D Mario come out since. Bowser's Fury was just a small little extra to a port of 3D World from the Wii U, so it has been a little bit of a while, and with the Mario movie coming out this April, it does make sense to think that maybe Nintendo wants a Mario game to come out relatively close to the movie to benefit from that extra publicity and have more sales, for sure. And also using Mario to launch a new system, they've done that before, it's worked out pretty well. But Zelda seems to have an even stronger track record here of pushing new systems. So it could go either way, but when you think about this weird release timing for May, and that it was delayed, and that they didn't give us a reason for the delay, and everything else I've mentioned, it's definitely in my mind that we could see new hardware maybe announced, say January or February, and it launches alongside Tears of the Kingdom in early May next year. It could take longer, maybe it comes out at the end of next year alongside a new 3D Mario, or maybe even beyond that. Maybe Nintendo has another plan. Something else to take into consideration, maybe Nintendo doesn't want to use a specific game to push new hardware, because they want to release the same games that are coming out for the current Switch on the next Switch as well, because they want to have more of a smooth transition. Maybe that's the case, but also they probably still would want to have some kind of major game come out during that time, right? Because even if it's not exclusive, which Tears of the Kingdom is definitely coming out for base Switch, don't worry there, new games like this still push hardware. For example, Splatoon 3 came out this year, and it definitely elevated hardware sales, as will Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Nintendo still likes to use major games to push hardware sales even for current systems, so if they have a new big system coming out, they're still going to want to put a new game to push the sales for that system and current systems as well. So there's still got to be some sort of major game to come out alongside whenever Nintendo does move on to its next big system. The best bets are either 3D Zelda or 3D Mario. So it's on my mind, I'm thinking about it. I'm not saying I 100% believe that this is happening, but I definitely think it's a conversation that should be had. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.